guys are
really got to get somebody good at DNR.
Folks, if we could begin to take our seats, we'll get the program started in about 1 minute. If we could get our seats, please. The numbers, millions, billions, trillions, people use them. General Panaro will use them in huge numbers during his talk today, but they're really big. Let me give you some macro numbers. The United States is $16.4 trillion in debt. Our GDP is less than $16 trillion a year. So our debt to GDP is over 100%. It's about 103%. That debt, $16.4 trillion, is going up. They didn't exactly raise the debt ceiling. It just said forget about it until May. It'll go up another $400 billion by May. But where is that debt? $5 trillion of it we owe to ourselves, Social Security trust funds, effectively. $11.6 trillion of it we owe to debtors of the United States government, bondholders, others. Okay, of that debt, about $5.5 trillion is owed to foreign countries, with China holding a couple of trillion of it. Lots of leverage for foreign countries. So if you look at just that portion, the privately held, as it were, or sovereign nation-held debt of the United States, it's about 73% of our GDP. That's really high. It's going up. It'll be 76% by the end of next year. It's 90%. Every economist says the economy is in deep, deep, deep trouble. Given various trajectories and what happens on sequester and what doesn't, various things happen. Numbers that are thrown out. $500 billion was cut out of the DoD projected expenditures as a result of the Budget Control Act 2011, right? And then sequester was supposed to kick in a year ago. As General Panaro said earlier, the super committee did not do its job, so the $1.2 trillion in cuts that were supposed to occur did not occur. That was going to be $200 trillion in interest savings, $500 billion in discretionary fund savings, $500 billion coming out of DoD, in addition to the $487 billion they'd already cut out in the Budget Control Act, okay? So now sequester is supposed to hit on March 1st. Lots of dealing is going on the Hill now with the President. He just announced he'd like to cut a deal yesterday. Who knows what will happen. But numbers for DoD, the overall budget is about $630 billion. Of that, $88 billion is your OCO funding, okay, for the wars overseas. About $528 billion is for the DoD baseline budget. The rest of it is the part of the Energy Department budget that goes toward nuclear weapons and comes into the DoD function for appropriations. Okay, those are some real rough numbers. Again, fast-paced this morning. This program is being webcast live, so everything is on the record. When you ask a question, please go to one of the microphones. This microphone will be posted there. There's another one there. Just state your name and ask the question quickly. So we move right through as many questions as we can.
On the National Guard and Reserve, and is now the chair of the Reserve Forces Policy Board. I don't think we'll find somebody more knowledgeable in this town on the issue of reserve matters than General Panaro.
Thanks, Drew. Appreciate it. Just want to talk to you today about a world of increasing threats and decreasing resources, and since there's some carryovers from the earlier talk, I'll try not to be as repetitive. And I want to talk a little bit about our Commission on the Guard and Reserve, which ran from 2005 to 2008. The Congress, as they were looking to the future, said, look, we need to figure out what it is we want the Guard and Reserve to do in the future. Do we really want this new operational reserve and all that? So they set this commission up. We worked for 2.5 years, made 130 recommendations, most all of which have been implemented in full or part. And one of the reasons they got implemented, and some of them are pretty significant departures from the status quo, was because of the great members of the commission, several of whom are here with me today, judgment in the current crew in the building pushing these issues as strong a team as I've seen in the last 20 years. So we're in this world of increasing threats and decreasing resources where, in my judgment, the Guard and Reserve are a true bargain for the taxpayer, and I'll talk about that in a second. It doesn't matter that they're a true bargain for the taxpayer. You still have to advocate that position in the building. And we could have, and you'll hear from them this morning, no better advocates than the leadership that we have in Reserve Affairs today. Does that mean they always agree with the things that we recommend, perhaps on the RFPB, or that come up from the services? No, but that's fine. I mean, you in a big government, you're not going to ever have 100% agreement. But I would tell you, my guess is 99% of the time, we're on the same wavelength, and we're fighting the bureaucratic demons in the building. And one thing that those that have been around town as long as we have, one thing you learn about the Pentagon is in the field, our military are magnificent warriors, none better, and they accomplish the mission. However, when you get in the Pentagon, it's a government bureaucracy. And I'm telling you, the Ice Age moved faster than the Pentagon bureaucracy does when it comes to making change. They are opposed to change. It's in their culture. It's in their nature. It's just the way they are. And it takes strong people. And so we're very fortunate, both in the services. We've got 3 assistant secretaries in the personnel area that are as good as any I've seen in many years. And by the way, let's face it, administrations come and go. Some of them get good people. Some of them don't. It just really depends. But I'm very pleased with the kind of support the reserve components are receiving in the building. But we're in a time when the budgets are going to go down, and therefore the long knives come out, and we've been there, seen that in the reserve components before. So we're going to have to argue the case on the merits. And when you argue the case on the merits, I want to outline a few reasons why I think the Guard and Reserve remain a true bargain for the taxpayer. And as we look at future missions, many of these could be done more efficiently and effectively for the national security by the Guard and Reserve. I will say to you that in our commissioners, when we had the agreement in August 2011 to raise the debt ceiling so that our country could pay the bills that previous Congresses and executive branches had run up. This isn't future spending, this is past spending. They put in place a mechanism to cut the deficit by $1 trillion over 10 years, which is necessary. We know we need to cut the deficit. And they created a commission or a committee that was going to find the $1 trillion in cuts out of a $41 trillion pot, which included entitlements, before you even considered raising any revenues. They couldn't do it. They didn't do it. And the 12 people that served on that commission, in my judgment, if they were in the military, we'd have court-martialed them for dereliction of duty, every single one of them. They should be serving in Fort Leavenworth today. They should be making golf shirts and plaques. You know, in the prison industries is what they ought to be doing. They shouldn't be still serving in the Congress. But so here we are. And then when we had the fiscal cliff in December, they dealt with taxes. And guess what? When you talk about entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, civil service retirement, pensions, agriculture subsidies, the vast majority of the entitlements in this country go to the middle class. They don't go to the homeless veterans. They don't go to, you know, 90-year-old elderly people. So there's this misnomer that somehow all the problems in our country are created because all the money is going to people that don't work for a living or are too old to take care of themselves. That's just total bunk, total baloney. The vast bulk of the entitlements go to middle-class America. They go to our fathers and mothers. You know, they go to our sons and daughters. If you look at where all the government publishes Treasury publishes a report every month about outlays. How much is the government spending? And if you go look at, and they do it by department, and only budget weenies like me would want to even see it, but I go look at it, and you look at where the outlays are. The number one outlays in the government are Health and Human Services. Why? Because that's who pays the health care bills and things like that. Then you get Social Security. Then you get defense. Defense has got large outlays, no question about it. But right after defense, Stanton Thompson worked for the Agriculture Department for many, many years. The next largest outlays are agriculture. Why? Because of all the subsidies we give farmers. Okay, who are farmers? Farmers are middle-class America. So the bottom line is that the only way you're going to solve the long-term deficit problem is everybody is going to have to bite the bullet, pay their fair share. We're going to have to look at the military entitlements, the domestic entitlements, subsidies and things like that, and you have to fix it over a 20 to 25-year period. You can't fix this overnight. And defense is going to share in that. The Budget Control Act took $500 billion, actually $489 billion out of the defense budget. But people say, oh my goodness, we've already paid at the bank. We've cut this huge, humongous amount of money out of defense. Oh, woe is me. Only in Washington, D.C. is a decrease in a projected increase a cut. The defense budget hadn't been cut one nickel. The defense budget is flat. It's at $525 billion a year, which in FY13 constant dollars is higher than the peak spending of Vietnam when we had 500,000 people in combat on the ground. And it's higher than the peak spending years of the Reagan buildup. It is huge. So what was cut was the fact that you see people talk about the 9% cut. That's over an annual basis. That's only if you cut it all in over a year. But if you cut it in 5 months, it's going to be 25 to 30% across the board. And I think the chiefs are not, crying uncle or not. I mean, it really is going to be devastating on our readiness and just about. It's about the dumbest thing I think I've ever seen in my lifetime in government. And I think Secretary Panetta is correct. It's shameless. It's irresponsible. It's insane. But right now, it's going to happen. And I hope somehow they figure out a way to not make it happen, but to do so, whatever. So you've got the sequester, and then you've got the continuing resolution. If they don't pass another CR, government's going to shut down. Somehow they're going to figure something out. I don't know when, and I don't know how much pain we're going to go through. Once they do, though, defense top line will come down again. So right now, let's say we're at the BCA level of $525 billion. The sequester cuts another $500 billion over 10 years. I think whatever compromise they work out to get us through this mess, and I hope they cut entitlements, and I hope they maybe add a little bit more revenues on the tax loophole side. They're going to cut discretionary spending, including defense. I think our best case is we're going to lose another 200 to 250 billion. Kind of split it in the middle. I don't know, Will, you're tracking it, Patty's tracking it. I mean, I think, it's going to come down. I don't know how much. Maybe it won't come down that much. But look, they're going to have less money. When they have less money, they're going to have to look at where do they get their best bang for the buck. The biggest problem we have in the Defense Department right now is we're spending more than we ever spent in our lifetime, and yet what do we have to show for it? So to me, the question for those of us that are strong defense supporters, everybody in this room, we should be asking, what are we getting for what we spend? In other words, are we getting the bang for the buck for the warfighters and the taxpayers? And in my judgment, we are not. If you take what's coming out on the output and you measure the size of our fighting forces today compared to when Jimmy Carter was president, 1980, at the end of his 4 years, a good Georgian, the Army was 50% larger than it is. We're spending 300% more today than Jimmy Carter spent. The Army recommended the volunteer force. In the early years, Will was working in the Senate in 1973 when I came there. We spent the first 10 years saving the volunteer force in its early years. Now, Thomas Gates said, you won't be able to pay for it. It won't be sustainable unless you make 3 fundamental changes. You've got to get rid of the 20-year retirement. You have to basically change the up-route promotion system, and you've got to change the pay and compensation system from time and grade to skills and performance. None of those changes have been made. In the last 10 years, the cost of personnel has doubled for the same size force. Military retirement is a $100 billion a year bill for 2.4 million retirees. We have 1.4 million active duty. The DOD healthcare bill, Patty Lewis is one of the world's experts on the DOD healthcare system. It's $52 billion a year for 9 million beneficiaries, 5.5 million are retirees and their dependents. You see the pattern here. And so the bottom line is it's just not on a sustainable course. And you can't change it overnight. It takes 20 years to change any of these things. You've got to responsibly grandfather everybody that's in the system today. But you could actually make some fundamental changes 20 years out and still save hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 20 years. If you went from a high 3 to a high 5, if you went from a 2.5 multiplier to a 2.0, if you had everybody retired age 60 like we do in the Guard and Reserve, you'd save $250 billion in just the next 10 years in the accrual funds. So you could actually save money. The healthcare system, as Patty knows, is tied to the overall runaway cost of our overall health care, Medicare, Medicaid, DOD, VA, and I mean that's a national problem. That's really what's driving the entitlement growth is health care. So we've got to make some fundamental changes. So where did the Guard and Reserve come in? On the RFPB, the Reserve Forces Policy Board, we just finished a study called the Fully Burdened and Life Cycle Cost of Military Personnel. And in that study, led by Executive Director Major General Jimmy Stewart, Jimmy, welcome this morning, and Colonel Robert Price, who was the lead analyst on that study, we spent a year looking at this and doing all the, again, we approached it the same way we did on the CNGR. I told the staff, I said, and the commissioners or the members of the RFPB, we're an independent body reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. And what got me started is when Secretary Panetta, asked me to be the chairman, I said, are you serious? I mean, you really, the fence, and my fellow commissioners have heard this speech many, many times, is to put a bayonet in the heart of a North Korean. We do not have a Department of Defense so we can show a terrorist our commissary card and say, look at the great benefit we get from a subsidized $5 billion a year, $1.3 billion subsidy to the world's 5th largest grocery chain, or I get free health care at age 43. So our study showed that the fully burdened cost of an active duty military person was $384,000 a year. Is that right, Robert? $384,000? Yes, sir. $384,000 when you add in all the costs. All they want to talk about in the Pentagon is the person's paycheck every 2 weeks. So Secretary Panetta said to me, Arnold, why is the Guard and Reserve more expensive than the active duty military? I shouldn't say that. Senior officials said to me, he's probably a senior official, he was probably one of them, but others. I'd bump into 4-star generals in the hall, and they say, Arnold, why are the Guard and Reserve more expensive than the active military? Who is telling you that? I said, let me ask you a question, sir, with all great respect and due deference to your high, exalted office. Let me ask you a question. We've had 850,000 Guard and Reserve personnel mobilized since 9/11. 850,000. How many barracks, how many tactical equipment shops, how many dependent schools, how many family housing units, how many child care centers, how many commissaries, how many battalion headquarters, how many parking lots, how many anything have you built to support the 850,000 that were mobilized? And how many of them have you torn down because we now have only 55,000 people mobilized? And they look at me and they, well, none. I said, okay, I rest my case. There is a cost to having the active duty military. When we started making the rounds and talking about the food fight between the active Air Force and the Guard and Reserve that many of you are familiar with, that the Congress, all 4 committees on a totally bipartisan basis, and we've been around a long, long time, totally rejected the Air Force's proposal. And it wasn't even close because they couldn't justify their decision because they were saying, well, the Guard retires at 45, the Guard person retires at 60. He draws free health care. By the way, the health care, $52 billion a year, 9 million beneficiaries, 5.5 million are retirees and dependents. So more people retired than serving on active duty. He draws his health care from age 45 to 85, Guard and Reserve from 60 to 85. And that differential was just in retirement, not counting the 20 years of active duty, was 2.7 million for the active and 800,000 for the Guard. So there's a huge cost differential that should be taken into account as we make decisions about the future force structure. Look, cost is not the only thing. And I mean, I'm the first to admit that. We told the building that you can't just make decision on cost. You're never going to replace the 82nd Airborne or Carrier Battle Group with Guard and Reserve. It's just not going to happen. It shouldn't happen. So I would say there are things that legitimately will always be in the active duty, no matter what it costs. But one, we ought to know what those costs are. And then when we're making decisions about where do we put the force structure to take care of cyber, the new warfare domain, where civilian skills of reservists working at Microsoft and working in Austin, Texas, are going to be far better than what they can recruit and retain on active duty. You know, where are you going to put Homeland Defense, you know, and worry about that 10-kiloton nuclear weapon in lower Manhattan? So you ought to know these cost differentials when you're making decisions about some of these future missions. So that's why we reported, you know, that study on the life cycle and fully burdened cost. I will tell you that in the building, you know, since I'm outspoken on all these entitlement issues, I get a lot of hate mail, and I've done my part as a small businessman to bolster the economy because I hired a food taster and a car starter. And then when we put that study out, some of the Save Our Benefits outfits here in town, I say we've changed the slogan from Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition to Praise the Lord and Pass the Benefits. They hired somebody from the Middle East at a B&W to try to run me over in downtown Washington, D.C. when I was crossing the street. They hit me going about 25 miles an hour and knocked me down the street. I was sore for a while, but I called up the Save Our Benefits guys and said it takes a lot more than a speeding automobile to take it, because most everybody in the country benefits from these benefits. That's why they don't want to tackle them. That's the problem. Again, if it was just homeless people and 95-year-old elderly people, we change the benefits because people are going to say, we don't care about the homeless people and the old people. They're not going to be with us very long. The reason you can't find a lot of political courage is because these benefits are so widespread. So I think they may be forced by circumstances to come to grips with this. There is a commission to look at the DOD healthcare, retirement, and benefit system that Congress created. But right now, it's pretty disgraceful when you look at the inability of the legislative branch of government to do their work, and the inability of the executive branch to work in a cooperative and thoughtful way. As taxpayers, as Americans, we should be fed up. And again, no profiles encouraged that I can find.
Gordon Austin, Vice President for Naval Services for the ROA. Would you clarify something for me on the health care? If a reservist retires at 60 and goes on the TRICARE system, the bulk of the health care costs changes over to Medicare at age 65.
You're probably right. You make a good point.
That's just a VA accountability form, but have we started to work?
We argued that we had three big cost elements. We argued that those costs outside DOD should be considered, including the cost of the VA, which are astronomical. Now, DOD is never going to agree to that. DOD, if you were asked DOD today, how much is military retirement, they would tell you $20 billion a year, because that's all they pay. The Treasury pays $100 billion. So the VA costs are valid costs, and they ought to be, when you're talking about what a fully burdened cost is, that's why we're broke in this country. Nobody looks at the total cost. So we would argue that those ought to be considered.
I'm Dr. Drew Miller with the Institute for Defense Analyses, retired Air Force. There's a lot of ACRC mixed studies going on looking at should we shift, and you're obviously for shifting more to the reserve, but I don't see much analytic effort going into looking at how do you better integrate the active and reserve forces. And from some of the work we've done, you probably get better cost effectiveness if you focus more on mixed.
We're facing now. What do you now think will happen in the next year's budget as it relates to the reserve components? Will we see a cut in the RC budget? Will we see a drop in end strength for the RC? Or will people start to think of the RC as maybe enhancing their roles and missions?
I have no clue, because the DOD hadn't finalized their FY14 budget, and I understand why they haven't. They don't have any idea what their top line or bottom line is. The Congress hasn't finalized the FY13 budget, so poor DOD. My instinct is that if they get kind of the run rate they'd like, around 525, you're not going to see a lot of blood on the floor. They're not going to want to go through these food fights that the Air Force has just been through. However, and if in the sequester, everybody's going to get hit equally, so they're going to hit the active training and the Guard and Reserve training, the active schools and the Guard and Reserve schools, the active and Guard and Reserve equipment maintenance, all that's going to deteriorate. But once it settles out, and let's say they've learned that over the next 10 years they're going to have 200 to 250 billion less dollars, then I think probably, and I'll defer to our folks from OSD and the Army, I think the long knives are going to be out again. We may revert to the bad old days where there was, competition. It's been pretty much sweetness and light, because the budget hadn't come down yet, except for the Air Force food fight that they lost. I'm hoping the other services are paying attention there. So I think over the next 2 years, again, I think we have to make the case on the merits. The Guard and Reserve is a bargain for the taxpayer. We should make it on the merits of the cost and the mission, and then let it sort itself out. But I think eternal vigilance would be the watchword, I would say, in the next couple of years as it relates to that.
Mr. Bernaro has been with us since 8 o'clock this morning, when he gave an hour-and-a-half lecture to many students from the National Defense University and the Reserve Component National Security course. He spent another 45 minutes with them during the break, and now he's talked to this group. He's losing his voice a little bit, but Mr. Bernaro, we deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. John Newman. John is the Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Army.
Or do I need to do that? I can do that. Okay, what I'm going to talk to you about, I guess I can't really, can I move around here, Bob, or is that a problem on your webinar?
It's better if you stay at the podium.
Okay. I don't particularly like podiums, but we'll do this. Okay, what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is these three areas, and to be honest, as General Panero said, it's an interesting time. I think most of you are close to what we're doing over in the building, and this is kind of difficult for us because we still don't have a 13 budget. We're watching the March timeframe, which everybody's watching that, but in the Army, that we could get a margin call of 14 to 16 billion in 13. And that will be a very, very difficult margin call to make. So again, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our in-strength and manpower resource challenges, total force policy, which is a really important tool in our toolbox, and the culture. And I think most of the Army people here in the room know your Army is a very large force, 1.1 million. It's split really pretty much down the middle, AC to RC. You've got about 550 AC, you got about 350 in the Guard, big combat force there, and then 200,000 in Bo's good USARC there. And again, as General Panero said, tons of these people have gone to war. Your Army right now really can't even go to war without your reserve component. So a lot of the capabilities, unique capabilities the Army needs are only in USARC. So they, when we mobilize active duty Army to send them somewhere, you've got reserve component people involved in that from the very get-go. So the difficulty now is how do we take a look at downsizing, how do we do this, where do we go? Obviously, we're the largest force, therefore we're going to be impacted the greatest. This first set of cuts that came across to the Pentagon, Army got 60% of that first cut, and that was a little bit painful. So some of the pushback that OSD gave back to us, we absorbed a big chunk of that. Let me go to my next slide here, and I'll tell you how we're going to try to do this. Opportunities and challenges. And again, for some of you that are close to what we're doing, and certainly Secretary Panero is, and a lot of the services, the Air Force has 3 components, the Marines have 2 components, the Army has 3 components, but in 09, let me tell you, the Army's tribal. I mean, they do a great job of coming together in wartime, and you can't tell the difference. I mean, when you put your Army on the battlefield, they all perform magnificently. They come back and they go tribal. And it's a constant battle on how do you get past that. So Army Total Force Policy, which took us from 09 to last year, right before AUSA, Secretary McHugh signed that. That was part of his presentation at AUSA. And it's a small document, 2.5 pages long, but it mostly levels the playing field. One training standard, one pay and personnel system. I mean, how do you access the reserve component easily? How can we move through the 3 components? So it's really a planning document that right now the Army and everything we're doing, all the planning, all the strategic planning we're doing, we're trying to integrate Army Total Force Policy into it. It will require a cultural change in how we do business, because in the past, sometimes it wasn't the best in your career if you got assigned to the reserve component. So we know we need to put some requirements in there that it's actually an enhancement if you serve or command. So we're looking at that. We're trying to figure out multi-compo blended, and to be honest, Chief of Staff was willing to discuss that with the RC. I mean, how do we do that? Title 11. Right now in the Army, you're authorized about 3,900 Title 11. So we have Title 10, which is your active duty and your USARC, Title 32, which is your Guard, and then you have some Title 11 people, which are Army advisors and people that work for First Army. So one of the things that happened in the last about 12 months is we finally finished 2.5 years late to Congress our study on the requirements of the full-time manning in the reserve component. And that generated a requirement which didn't surprise anybody. Around 25 to 30,000 people the reserve component really needs full-time into their formations to really generate their operational force. A lot of people, it might make sense at division levels to definitely, that might be a 5-meter target. But how do you get down into the brigades and the formations? But we definitely want to look at that study. We want to look at, can we grow Title 11 above the 3,900 that we have now? Can we grow it to a larger number and use those people the same way right now that we use Army advisors? You wouldn't want somebody just out in the formations watching what they do. You want people out in the formations actually commanding, bending wrenches, flying airframes, doing all the stuff that the reserve components do. So there's an opportunity there. We'll just have to see that. There's a cost associated with that. But by the same token, you've spent an incredible amount of money training these people. It would be a shame to attrit them and not try to figure out how we can move them into the RC. Plus, it allows us to do this blending of the ACRC, change the culture a little bit. One of the things that we've got to do, and it's really a problem in the Army, we have to have a pay and personnel system. And for those of you, some of you that are long since retired, remember when Dimers, which was way back when, well, you know, that thing is, you know, obviously we're not doing Dimers anymore, but in Army, we're doing IPSA, the Integrated Pay and Personnel System, and how to use them in certain areas. But there are a lot of areas that we may be able to do this, but it will require a cultural paradigm shift on how we do that, because in the reserve component, 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks annual training, but do we need to do that as we go forward? Is there a different way that we can do this and still let them work in their MOSs? So we're looking at a lot of different things. Under challenges, no consensus on definition of operational reserve. And certainly that's being worked up at General Panero's area, and it's being worked up at OSD. But as a taxpayer, this gets back to, you know, your reserves need to be part of the operational force. And I think we've demonstrated, particularly in Army, in 11 years, and ESGR, I thought Young was going to be here today, but in ESGR, we've come a long ways where the American population and the employers get the fact that it's probably a good investment for them if they allow their people to serve in the reserve component. And so how do we get to where we can use the reserve on a regular basis? 12304B, for instance, again, if you're programming and budgeting for stuff, and most reservists don't have a problem. If you can tell them lead time on when they need to do this, you could use them for a lot of stuff OCONUS. So when the COCOM commanders are out there looking for assistance, 12304B may give them an opportunity that they didn't have before, you know, where it had to be a named, documents. Again, it gets back to a lot of this stuff is just words on paper. So until we get the right people in the right place that say we want to go there, sometimes it takes an epiphany, whether it's in your life or our life, and to be honest, we may be about to get one of those. We may be driven financially. But the good news is we do have Army Total Force Policy. We have 12304A, we have 12304B. We're probably better than we've ever been as an Army that we're a total Army. So right now, even in the reserve component, if you line up a large number of senior people in the reserve component, most of them have right sleeve patch. So they've gone over, they've served, so they've been used to working with the Army. So again, it'll get interesting as this goes forward. I would tell you that in Army, we're working very hard on our budget issues to try to avoid what happened in the Air Force. So we're trying to be open, we're trying to discuss this, but the tribalism thing a lot of times just enters into it, you know, when it gets right down to it. So we know it won't be easy as we go forward. We know we need to reorganize the Army. I think really smart people sitting around the table, I think we'll get this done. General Odierno wants to go there. He sees that we'll probably have to do that, but more to follow. Let me stop there and I'll answer some questions if you have any pure Army questions. This is we got one, okay.
Sir, Jim Mulvihill, Army Reserve. I had the pleasure to meet you a couple of years back at General Rega's Dining In up in Chicago. Really appreciate your comments about tribal. I run a school at Fort Hood, maintenance school under the 80th Training Command. And speaking of the integration, I wondered if you could speak more towards the One Army school system as a vehicle towards some of that integration.
4 years ago when I came into Army, I was an Air Force guy. I was all three compos. My dad was a chief in the Navy. I'm a Navy brat. I was a career Air Force officer, and now I'm working for Secretary of the Army. Go figure. But when I came in, we were 13 platforms where we're training, all the active duty, and then put active duty instructors out at the RTIs. So I would tell you that in our world, the Army's come a long, long ways on licensing, credentialing, college credit, and trying to figure out how they use one Army school system. Because if the program of instruction, the POI, that's the term that we use, is the same, to be honest, for those of you in the room that have been or are instructors, after you teach that a couple, 3 times, unless they reinvent something, hey, guess what? You're going to be a very good instructor. So again, we've done a lot of good things. I think we're positioned well if we have to cut. Nobody wants to make these cuts, but if we have to make these cuts, we've built very good training facilities. We've got, to be honest, when you look at the big active duty installations, we had a discussion, do we need to take a look at, if we downsize the AC, is there locations that it makes sense to let RC fall in on AC installations where we have good brick and mortar, and then take a look at the MILCON budgets that the RC has, maybe we can reduce that. We even had a big discussion on the Army needs to look nationwide, particularly in Compo 2 and 3, and build a one-to-N list where some locations that may really make sense, where you have a really old armory and a really old USARC readiness center, can we merge those, particularly if we get a new BRAC? And we did that in the last BRAC. Can we merge those and then build a new readiness center that's a federal facility that doesn't need a state match? Now, this group, you'd have to ask yourself, we shouldn't probably just do that in Army. When you look across the United States, if the Marines have a training facility, should we look at that? One of the arguments I would make is anytime we can move on to an airport, if it doesn't make any sense where we build it, if we can build it inside the perimeter fence on an airport, because I would tell you in the Army world, the ThreatCon level is a problem for us. What's the good news? We're in Snow, by the way, spent the whole 2.5 days down there, and let me tell you, that guy is down there making sausage on how do you do risk management. But certainly part of the discussion is just like 12304A and B. We were very pleased that Congress gave us that, and to be honest, Dave McGinnis and Secretary McCarthy were hard on that. We did a ULB inside the building. We asked for $15,000 under 12304B. That ULB never made it out of the building. But meanwhile, people like these folks here, ROA and Naugus, took that on and got that into the NDAA. But when the language came out, it wasn't exactly what we wanted. We wanted $15,000, they gave us $60,000. That was a good news story, but it wasn't exactly the language that we wanted, because even under 12304A, when we exercised that, which we did under Sandy, there's some issues that come up on, you have people in all different pay statuses on the ground working beside each other. So we know we need to get after that, because, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, when you look on the RC side, for sure, if we go to IPSA, we have to figure out we're only going to pay in a few statuses, and maybe that's something that General Panero can take on, but we've got to get this down to where, we don't have multiple pay statuses. Part of it is the special pays, and I mean, when I waded into that one, we've got to get there. We're not there yet. Smart people are working on that. Any other questions? I'm probably over my time, Bob.
Mr. Newman, thank you so much. I know you've got an exceptionally busy schedule today. Thank you again for being with us today.
In the future, maybe Bob will host something, because I've been involved in a lot of CA stuff. Today I'm hosting a humanitarian assistance initiative that's trying to bring Navy to Army in the Pacific. And I've got probably 8 NGOs, so whether Sister Cities, Rotary International, I've got all these people that took time out. And of course, Bob was kind enough. I was saying, man, I can't do this because I've got all...
Pleasure to be here and to address many of the issues concerning the comprehensive review, and many of the points that you're going to be seeing here, thank God, have already been touched on in some form. I'm also, I think, well aware of the fact that we're running behind schedule, right? So what I'm going to do is take you through just so I get this right, a quick review of the comprehensive review of the future roles of the reserve component, which came out of the 2010 QDR, and actually relate those findings and recommendations in the comprehensive review, which we see as an enduring document of enduring validity to advance the value-added proposition of the reserve components. And I'm going to link that to the next opportunity to advance that proposition, which is the 2014 QDR. So I'm going to cover very quickly a status of the comprehensive review. First of all, what you see here is about. Is the time right for them to talk about these types of opportunities? I would submit absolutely. In the 2010 QDR, we were still in a big fight, lots of OCO, money's flowing. Why should we think about anything that would be cost-effective and cost-efficient when you're rolling in dough? You know, from a business point of view, you know, if you have to return profits to investors and shareholders, you would think about that in fat times, not so in a bureaucracy that doesn't produce a profit and is, just isn't aligned to that way of thinking. So that's one of the rebalancing options as you see here. Let's take a look at some of the others. You'll see there integration of AC/RC units. We had that once. Those of you who may remember Capstone, Round Out, right? Did that make sense? Did that work? Yeah, it was a viable system back then. Is that a possibility now? I would say yes. Is the easy transition from components, active service, civil service, those types of things. Not easy now and should be made easier. Differential service, another idea of contracts with, in particular types of units where people are on a very short-term mobilization timeline, because these are capabilities that reside in the reserve component that need to go out the door very quickly, and we can't go through a laborious, long notification type of process. So, as in documents in which we, or processes in which we in OSD Reserve Affairs have engaged. The one that is coming up now, which I've highlighted in red, what I want to focus on is the quadrennial defense review. What does the quadrennial defense review require us to do? You'll see here I've highlighted some of the language in Title 10, Section 118, which is the QDR, and talks about a 20-year forward look. The original QDRs, actually before it was called a QDR, was a bottom-up review. A total relook. Everything's on the table from the bottom-up review, strategy, force structure, mix, roles and missions, and so forth, and build a strategy for the next 20 years. And that with the QDR reviewed every 4 years. So where you may have annual documents like a defense planning guidance, annual documents like the budget process and so forth, even though it looks at the future year defense plan over a 5-year period, you're really looking at 1 year out and 2 years out. Here is the opportunity with the QDR to take a long-term look. And you'll see one of the things that we use as a bumper sticker down on the bottom there of the slide, which says the reserve components, we preserve capability, we mitigate risk, and we do that at a reduced cost. Two very specific areas in the QDR that obtain to the reserve components is the number 7, which is the RC roles and missions, primarily as in terms of the defense strategy, i.e. an expeditionary warfighting RC roles and missions. Number 16 talks about homeland defense as well as defense support to civil authorities. Let's just take a look. The QDR, a big opportunity to advance, in our mind, the comprehensive review, roles and missions, and force balancing recommendations. As I said, it's a 20-year forward look. It's a bottom-up review. The security environment remains extremely volatile. From all of the things that you read about in the newspapers, the world is not any more peaceful, nor is it, and it's very complex because it goes from insurgency to potential adversaries, with our pivot to the east, of the possibility of regardless of how remote we hope it may be, we still have to plan for major combat operations and full spectrum operations in the future. So with that combination of factors, this is an opportunity to advance the value-added proposition of the reserve components. We're approaching the QDR in a collaborative way from the OSD-RA perspective, and that is that we're looking at the working together with what we've called the RC enterprise, because the reserve component enterprise is, and if it doesn't hang together, it will hang separately. Number one. And with the cultural issues that we have in the building, it is very important. I think General Panelists alluded to it. The ugly fights that could occur between components that would divert us from focusing on the bigger picture, which is regardless of which reserve component you may belong to. We still all collectively have a value-added proposition, and we have a cultural bias that needs to be overcome, and it's much better if we do that together. So we're looking to collaborate on the inputs that we make to the QDR. Controversial to say those are missions that are important, but not mainstream. If our mission is to fight and win the nation's wars, then those roles have been to support that, but not to be directly involved in it. The last 10 years, we have been directly involved in fighting and winning the nation's wars. Is it not possible that that paradigm, that additional out-of-the-box use of the reserve component, and out-of-the-box, when you look at it in the context of the traditional role of an operational and a strategic reserve, are those missions, those roles and missions not possible? I would submit that under this, the circumstances that we constrained budget, force reduction, threats aren't going away, combatant commanders still have requirements that are not being fulfilled, in the force, in the presence and posture missions that they have in, pardon me, in what we call phase zero, i.e. in where you don't have a contingency, that offer opportunities for the reserve component. And so therefore, list also is I do think that the reserve component, and we in OSD-RA, and I'm sure that this that this is a shared mantra, if you will, amongst all the the reserve component enterprise, that we mitigate risk, we preserve capability and capacity, and we can do that at a reduced cost. I mean, that is acceptable. So therefore, as we look at the QDR, as we look at every opportunity that we have to interface with the active component decision makers in the services, with OSD policy and the controllers into the reserve component, unless, of course, that capability resides solely in the reserve component. And that may drive, that occurred, that is the fact today. There are certain formations and certain capabilities that reside in the reserve component that will be used. So that decision has already been made in a force mix decision on the part of the services to say that's how we're going to be using the the RC. That AC-RC mix discussion of earlier has already been made. There are opportunities to use the reserve component beyond that post 9/11, or post 2014, post OEF. I will stop there, and if there's time, entertain some questions. I've given my my email address up there. I know that's probably dangerous, but nonetheless, if you have questions that weren't able to be answered or they occur to you at some point in time, please feel free to send me an email. And my staff will be glad to work the actions.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Patrick. That was terrific. And I just, we've got a big row ahead of us in the next year as the QDR evolves. It's going to be, it was kind of ignored in 2010, and certainly ROA and many of the reserve entities in the city are going to be focusing a lot on the QDR over the next year. I'm going to take just a little pause for a second. We're welcoming a battle ops pilot, and General Young is the chief. We have the Chief of the Naval Reserve, the Deputy Chief of the Air Force Reserve, and the Chief of Staff of the Army Reserve, and General Young had also served as Deputy Commander of the Army Reserve in his previous life. So, Admiral Braun, I'll turn right to you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I was asked to talk about the challenges and opportunities that are present for the Navy Reserve right now. And so I will tell you, I've been in the job for about 5 months now, and we've taken a look at our focus areas for the Navy Reserve. We've aligned those with our Chief of Naval Operations, 3 tenets: warfighting first, operate forward, and be ready. And so as we look to the future, our focus areas are to deliver a ready and capable force, to be able to provide the capabilities that the Navy needs, and also to enable the service of our sailors and their families. And so as we look at the challenges, knowing that I've only got a few minutes to speak here, I'm going to go right into the challenges that I see right now. And of course, for us, the big one for this year and for the future is the budget situation, the fiscal environment. And so looking this year at the continuing resolution and sequestration, we've looked at the impact to us. And of course, there are significant impacts to the Navy fleet overall. So for us, the challenge will be how to keep that force ready and capable with the cuts that we see coming. Over the next 2 years, we'll have significant cuts in the Naval Expeditionary Combat Command, NECC, and this is whether or not we have sequestration. This was programmed already. So as we've pulled out of Iraq and eventually Afghanistan, the Navy has decided to cut our NECC forces. And so we're going from 12 reserve component CB battalions down to 6, and 9 active component battalions down to 6. And so overall, if you look at the CB capability and cargo handling capability, it's over about 4,000 billets in the Navy Reserve. And so for us, that's one of our big challenges, because as we look at those sailors and we look at the incredible work that they've done over the past 12 years, they are so skilled and they've got so much experience that I don't want to lose that capability in the Navy Reserve. So I think it's very important that we look for other areas where we can retrain those sailors to support in maybe new growth mission areas. But that is a big challenge for us just because of the sheer numbers. We are a force right now of 64,000 on our way down to 60,000. I will tell you that in 2001, our force was at 90,000. So we've been continually cut over the past few years, as the Navy at large, the active component Navy has as well. But it is important for you to understand that on 9/11, we were at 90,000 sailors, and today we're at 64,000 going down to 60. So managing those cuts at NECC for those CBs and cargo handlers is very important for us. I will say another challenge is determining the whole balance of active component and reserve component within the Navy. What skill sets can be moved to the Navy Reserve? What's the balance that we should have? And what should be operational missions and what should be more of a strategic mission? And so we're looking very closely at that. People-wise, of course, my concern as we pull out of Afghanistan and we're not mobilizing as many people is how to maintain the force as ready and as capable and as integrated as we are today. Because I look at the force right now and it really is amazing at how integrated we are and how seamless it is between active component and reserve component. And I want to still hang on to that same the same dynamic out and canvassing the reserve component to see if there's anybody who's interested in coming on active duty full time. And then I also want to mention IAs, our individual augmentees and our mobilizations. Right now we're really picking up the majority of the IAs or mobilizations going forward. And so at this point, for this year, we're expecting about 3,500 of our selected reserve to be mobilized forward. Last year, it was about 4,000. The year before that, 5,000. Year before that, 7,000. So you can see that the trend is going down every year, but we still anticipate about 3,500 this year and next year, and probably about 1,000 to 1,500 in the 2 years following that. I think the great news is that we've got sailors who are volunteering, selected reserve sailors who still are volunteering, families who are supportive, employers who are supportive, and so I think that
But it's not clear even what this year's budget reality is with sequestration and the continuing resolution, and we've kind of talked about that this morning. It's clear the reserve component is critical to our nation's defense and homeland support, more so than any time in our history. But it's not clear how the DoD will evolve in post 9/11 era as we draw down in Afghanistan and make the strategic shift to the Pacific. It's clear that we need to get some clarity. Let me offer a few points. First, clearly the reserve component delivers the return on investment by being cost efficient and effective. But in reality, what is our return on investment? This is a tough question to answer, but we need to try, because as we look at the active component versus the reserve component mix, cost is part of the equation. The Reserve Forces Policy Board's recent report gives us an apples-to-apples comparison of active versus reserve military personnel costs by generating the full burden cost that Mr. Panero talked about earlier this morning. We should be looking at this in a whole of government way by including the costs of retirement and the payments from the Department of Treasury, Veterans Affairs, Labor, and Education. It's important that we look beyond just the DoD's bill. What is the bill to our nation? And the DoD will need to keep up. What's not clear is how. The concern from the SecDef on down is the potential for a cyber Pearl Harbor. But this could also become a black hole that we throw money into. Looking at the future of the Air Force Reserve, I think this is one area we have a much bigger role. Unlike in air, where Bernoulli's laws make up the predominance of those rule sets and govern it, cyber is totally different. In the cyber world, everything changes daily because mankind makes the rules. The domain changes with the technology, making it difficult and expensive for the military to keep up. But in the civilian sector, you must keep up. You must be on the cutting edge, or you are left behind and out of business because it's all about the bottom line. The Reserve has IT professionals that spend their time on the cutting edge of technology in their civilian jobs, working for corporations like Microsoft and Dell and Google and all those companies that are deep into the cyber community. On the weekend, they put on a uniform, bringing those skills to help out their country. Skills need to be on the cutting edge to outduel the bad guy who's armed with the latest technology. And when firing those cyber bullets, that meet all the combatant requirements that exist today. We want to find a way to make that happen, and if we're willing to grow these mission areas and we're proving we're good at those core capabilities such as air mobility and the other core function master plans that we involve ourselves with in the reserve, and we have 12 core function master plans within our Air Force, and our reserve touches all 12 of those. So if we've demonstrated that we can meet that capability in those mission sets, maybe we should seek to increase the...
You're a Federal Army Reserve. We're delighted to be here today, and a little intimidated to follow somebody who quotes Bernoulli's law in his opening remark. As a poor dumb liberal arts guy, I think I used to know what that was, but anyway, we're again...
Economics degree,
yeah, well,
so I can't talk.
Anyway, so I have just a few comments, and then thought that I would give some time back maybe for questions. So
The Army Reserve is in a strong place right now. You should be proud of that. You helped get it there. Our end strength sits at about 201,000. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Our re-enlistments are as high as they've ever been. Our attrition is as low as it's ever been. We currently have about 12,000 people forward deployed, 8,000 of those in Afghanistan, and then another 4,000 or so here kind of advertising than actual get out the vote kind of events, if you will. And so we're worried about that. We're worried that that'll have an impact on our end strength. Sequestration for us is a significant emotional event like it is for everybody. Maybe a little less so than it is on active duty because our appropriations are separated. Some of the way that we've built our force is a little different, so we're not as reliant on temps and terms as an example. But we're going to feel it for sure, and we already are feeling it. We have 800 Miltech vacancies right now that the hiring freeze has essentially prohibited us from going ahead to fill. That's a lot. 800 is, when you think about what a typical company level formation has in the Army Reserve, you really have probably 3 full-time people there. And so that's a unit that is not going to have one of those 3 people. And so that, or in this case, 800 units that aren't going to have those kind of people. We know there'll be training events toward the back half of the year that we'll have to rationalize or consolidate or even cancel. I mentioned the recruiting mission before. And then I think, there's all sorts of second and third order effects that you'll see. I'm going to a meeting later this afternoon where they're going to talk about how the school throughput in certain schoolhouses that are contractor dependent is going to have to come way down. And so we haven't even really, frankly, kind of gotten our arms around what that means for our formations. And, you can look at it and say, well, that the school throughput will decline so that the backlog for things like BOLIC and for basic training will increase. And how does that impact your formations a year from now, 2 years from now? Well, it's not good, but how bad is it? I don't think anybody, really knows at this point. General Talley's got a couple priorities. He's been in command. He's got lots of priorities as his chief of staff. I know. Believe me, he's got lots of priorities and lots of things that we're working on, lots of exciting things that we're working on, provide to help prevent, shape, and win. And so the planning construct in that is that we plan to make an investment of about 100 to 120 people total in what we call Army Reserve engagement cells. And these will be 10 to 15 person full-time teams down at the ASCC level to help coordinate the usage of the theater enabling commands that we have with the Army in terms of theater security cooperation and regional alignment. So you'll hear more about this Army Reserve Engagement Cell and then a smaller version called an Army Reserve Engagement Team over the next couple months as we begin to not only socialize this, but go ahead and make the investment. And General Talley said that he's going to go ahead and do that. And the first ones you'll see will roll out at USERPAC and USERAF, and then most likely R North with a contingent also at 8th Army. So that's the plan piece of that, or one of the main components of the plan piece. The prepare piece is what we've been doing really well, really, for the last several years, and that is continue to focus our formations on
the panel. If people would please go to the microphones in the aisle to address your question to either a person or the panel. Jack.
Yes, this is a question for the Army Reserve. Thank you very much, sir, for your discussion. A real quick question. One of the topics that's is a challenge now is reserve unemployment. I know it's across the DoD and the Department of Labor and VA a top challenge right now. And I was just curious, ROA and other groups were very instrumental in helping General Stoltz set up the Employment Partnership of the Armed Forces. They called it EPI back in the day. I was just curious if you've been in discussions with General Talley on his views of where the Army Reserve EPAF program is heading.
Yeah, I think EPATH has been a huge success story, and General Talley's all in on EPATH. We've not decided to take any substantially different course. We have merged our website into the H2H website. That just happened, I think, just a couple weeks ago. I may be a little off on that, but and that makes sense to us to have a single platform. But if a website could solve unemployment, we'd have a 3% unemployment rate, okay? Because you've got lots of websites to do that. So we think that what EPATH offers, it's still a pretty...
Prior to the sequestration discussion, I've heard talks from the likes of General Broadway, maybe looking at the Miltech force and maybe some reforms there for commensurate roles with their TPU status. I wondered if you could also speak to the AGR program as it has grown over the years in terms of with the restructuring that we will see, if that likely will change in terms of maybe downsizing.
Well, I think on the Miltex, just real briefly, General Talley has expressed an interest in trying to be more flexible with the program, to have more non-dual status Miltex, but not do away with Miltex or anything like that. So, there's certain issues that kind of historically we've had with Miltex, particularly in certain parts of the country where you have a lot of turnover, and you're constantly rehiring 10% of your workforce. So we think that maybe one way to get after that is to have more non-dual status technicians. With regard to AGR, I think part of the answer to your question is a budget resolution question, meaning how the budget resolves itself. We're already in the Army Reserve the leanest full-time force. We have about 13% of our force. When you do the math, all these things are kind of nuanced and tied together. I hope that answered your question.
If I could just make a comment also on that. For the Navy Reserve, when we look at the ratio of FTS to selected reserve, we've got about 10,000 FTS right now, and only 1/3 of those are working with CELRES. So 2/3 of those people of those sailors are forward with the fleet, engaging with the fleet at any one time so that they can bring back that fleet perspective to the reserve force. So I think it's important to point out that only 1/3 of our FTS force are actually working with training and administration of reserves at any one time.
Shannon Purvis, Air National Guard. General Young, my question is for you, and pertaining to the National Guard has the state partnership program doing engagements overseas to help with building relationships in partner capacity. The Air Force has their mobility support advisory squadrons put together to do the same thing, and now you're talking about the regional alignment engagement teams. In my opinion, you can't have too many people building partnership capacity. It's absolutely critical and much needed. But a big issue is synchronization of efforts.
Okay, well, how does this group rationalize what's going on with the Guard or the Air Force Reserve or others? Because I think a lot of that is going to take place at the COCOM level. But these ARECs and ARETs, the teams, can certainly help do that. And because there is sort of an infinite demand for the air security cooperation kind of missions, right? And we'll never run out of business in that sense. So I think your point's really valid, and it's one that we could probably do better on.
Before I ask us to thank our panel, I'm going to make a quick comment, and then I just want to give my boss a heads up back there, General Davis. I'll ask you to come up for some closing comments. And also, I'm going to give you just a quick run through of a couple of programs we've got coming up. We've talked a little bit about the schoolhouses in various ways in education. On the 12th, we're doing a program with the United States Institute of Peace, where we're going to be doing conflict termination. We're going to be doing a program on education for military officers as they enter fragile states. And General Irizarry from the SWIC will be with us, Brigadier General Ferd Irizarry, who's the, I guess you'd call him the principal of the Special Warfare Center, and the head of education for USIP, the big civilian institution here in Washington that gives a lot of educational programs for military officers and civilians going into conflict areas. That morning, we're going to be doing a program with a group of about a 40-person alliance, a workshop on war termination, as we prepare for a major conference at James Madison University in May on that same topic, which we anticipate will be a huge conference on that. We're going to have 40 people just for the planning conference. We expect several hundred for the actual event. As we move through the month, we're going to be holding a program on Vietnam, taking a look back at it. As we move into March, we're going to be holding a big program with the Strategic Studies Institute of the Army War College on the future of land warfare. We'll be doing a program on air mobility. As we move into April, we'll be doing a big JOPDS with...
Most important stories on defense of the day. One of the frustrations for serving reservists is often getting access to the early bird and the aggregation of stories about defense. Well, ROA is doing that. It, as I said, is free. All you have to do is just give us your email address, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you will get an email feed either on your smartphone or your PC with the 8 to 10 most important stories of the day on defense. And there is most days a story on reserve strength or reserve life. In order to access that, you just go to www.smartbrief.com/ROA, and that will give you your registration.